Ever since the Israeli victory during the wars of 1948 and 1956, the Arab coalition, led by Egypt, Syria and Jordan, was eager to change the situation in the region by defeating Israel. Both sides understood that the conflict was far from over and were preparing for the next stage of confrontation. International interference and the inability of the sides to find a settlement made one of the most iconic conflicts of the modern era, the Six-Day War, inevitable. On May 13, 1967, the Soviet Union falsely informed Egypt about the concentration of 11 to 13 brigades of the Israeli Defense Forces with an intent to strike Syria. In response, Egypt started concentrating forces along the border with Israel in Sinai, and on May 16th demanded that the UN peacekeeping forces leave the peninsula. At the same time, Israel refused the request of the UN to deploy the UNEF on their side of the border. In the next few days, Egypt, Israel, Jordan and Sudan started mobilization of their forces, Iraq sent expeditionary forces to Jordan, and Saudi Arabia expressed its willingness to participate in military actions. But the turning point, which made the full-scale confrontation inevitable, was the decision of Egypt to block Israeli ships from entering the Straits of Tiran on May 22nd and 23rd. On June 1st, Israel established a national unity government, which on June 4th decided to go to war. The Arab coalition of Egypt, Jordan and Syria had an advantage over Israel in deployed troops, with 240,000 against 100,000, in tanks with 2,504 against 800, and in aircraft with 957 against 300. Israel planned to strike on June 5th with Operation Focus, which aimed to destroy the Egyptian Air Force. Israeli media published false reports claiming Israeli soldiers were on vacation, while their pilots were carrying out training sorties as usual. Their intelligence helped make this training as realistic as possible. They also damaged the tracking antenna of the US Embassy to prevent the Americans finding out about the operation before the strike took place. The Israeli pilots were informed about the start of the operation only 5 hours in advance. At the same time, the Egyptian air defense system was effectively off on June 5th. Nearly 200 Israeli aircraft attacked 14 Egyptian airfields and caught them absolutely off guard. 338 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed and 100 pilots were killed within 3 hours. The Jordanian and Syrian air forces attacked Israel in retaliation at 11 AM on June 5th. The response of the Israeli Air Force was to attack their airfields, which led to the destruction of all 28 Jordanian, 53 Syrian and 10 Iraqi planes. Operation Focus was a decisive success. Israel lost only 19 planes in this operation and guaranteed its total air dominance for the rest of the war. The ground war was taking place on 3 fronts: the Sinai front, the Jordanian front, and the Syrian front. On the Sinai front, the Egyptian forces consisted of 7 divisions, 4 armoured, 2 infantry, and 1 mechanized infantry. Egypt had 100,000 troops and 900 to 950 tanks in the Sinai, so Israel concentrated 3 divisions consisting of 6 armoured, 1 infantry, 1 mechanized infantry and 3 paratrooper brigades for a total of 70,000 men and 700 tanks along this front. Israel's plan was to catch the Egyptians off guard by attacking simultaneously with airstrikes, and attacking through the northern and central routes in the Sinai Peninsula instead of the central and southern routes used during the Sinai War. On the 5th of June at 7:50 AM, the northernmost Israeli division, consisting of 3 brigades and commanded by Major General Israel Tal, started its advance towards Arish through Gaza with an aim to encircle Khan Yunis, while the paratroopers were ordered to take Rafah. Initially, the Egyptians offered little resistance, since their intelligence concluded that this was a diversion rather than a main attack. However, soon resistance against the 60th Armoured Brigade ramped up. This did not stop the Israeli forces from reaching the Khan Yunis railway junction in 4 hours. Afterwards, the IDF advanced on Sheikh Zayed and defeated fierce Egyptian resistance thanks to air domination. The road to Arish was open, and by 8 am on the 6th of July, elements of the 79th Armoured Battalion and the 7th Brigade entered the suspiciously quiet city. Suddenly the Egyptians started firing from the balconies and windows, and there was a heavy battle going on for control of the city. The IDF was only able to take full control of the city after reinforcements were sent. The northernmost division then split into 2 parts. One of them continued the advance on the Suez Canal, while the second group turned south and captured Bir Lafan and Jabal Libni. Further south, on the 6th of June, the 14,000-man, 150-tank-strong Israeli 38th Armoured Division under Major General Ariel Sharon was confronted by the Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Saadi Naguib, consisting of 16,000 troops and 90 tanks. Israel successfully advanced towards Abu Aghaila. The paratroopers landed behind Egyptian positions and sowed enough confusion to weaken the artillery of the Egyptian defense, which opened the way for the IDF to capture Katef. It was followed by a fierce close tank battle, which ended in an Israeli victory, with 40 Egyptian and 19 Israeli tanks destroyed. The Egyptian forces in Sinai were still largely intact, but their field marshal, Abd el-Hakim Amir, panicked and ordered the retreat of all units from Sinai after hearing about the fall of Abu Aghaila. This order did not elaborate on the sequence and manner of the retreat, which only decreased the defensive capabilities of the Egyptian troops. During the following days, the IDF continued its advance westward and inflicted heavy losses on the Egyptians. Despite episodic heavy resistance by the Egyptians, as in Bin Gefgafa, the napalm bombing by Israeli aviation and the uncontrolled retreat weakened the morale of the Egyptian troops. Instead of catching retreating Egyptians, the IDF decided to capture 3 passes from Sinai to the Egyptian mainland and face the Egyptian troops there. Although the IDF was not able to stop all the Egyptian troops from crossing, these passes became a killing ground, with 10,000 Egyptians being killed in one day alone. The capture of Sinai was completed by the fall of Sharm el-Sheikh on June 7th and Ras Sudah on June 8th. On June 9th, the UN Security Council achieved armistice between both sides. Israel wanted to avoid confrontation with Jordan and Syria before defeating Egypt, but the offers of neutrality to Jordan were rejected, as the Egyptian President Nasser persuaded King Hussein of Jordan that Egypt had an advantage against Israel. On the morning of the 5th of June, both sides started to fire, but Israel attempted a last-gasp attempt to avoid confrontation with Jordan by passing its message requesting peace through the UN representative, Bull. King Hussein countered that it was too late, and the Jordanian Air Force was already on the way. Jordanian and Iraqi aviation started shelling Israeli-controlled West Jerusalem, which caused 16 military and 20 civilian casualties, with 900 buildings damaged. Israel responded with its own air attack within Operation Focus, which damaged the military aviation infrastructure of Jordan and secured Israeli air dominance. East Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan at the time, and the Jordanian army took position in the UN residency, the government house, to fire on the Israeli sector. The Jerusalem Brigade's Reserve Battalion 161 of Israel took the government house despite heavy losses and forced the Jordanians to retreat to Bethlehem. Later on that day, Israel encircled eastern Jerusalem with the Jerusalem Brigade from the south and the mechanized Harel Brigade and 55th Paratroopers Brigade from the north. A fierce battle took place for Ammunition Hill. Jordanian resistance was so strong that the IDF lost all but 2 of their attacking officers, and achieved the goal only after 4 hours. The 55th Paratroopers Brigade afterwards drove eastwards, reaching Mount Scopus and defeating the other Jordanian positions around the American colony. Towards the evening of June 5th, the mechanized Harel Brigade succeeded in taking Letron and Ramallah. Also, the 163rd Infantry Battalion secured Abu Tor and cut the old city from Bethlehem and Hebron. On June 7th, the Israeli Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, ordered the IDF to enter the old city, despite reservations and concerns by the Israeli government. The fighting was conducted solely by the paratroopers out of fear of destruction of holy sites. The IDF took control of the old city with little resistance. Judea, Hebron, Bethlehem, and Nablus were also captured by the IDF on June 7th. Remnants of the Jordanian army fell back into Jordan. Israel was victorious on this front as well. Syria also believed Nasser about Egypt's early success in the conflict and sent its aviation to attack Galilee. This attack was intercepted by Israeli aircraft. A minor ground attack was also attempted by the Syrians, hoping to capture the water plants at Tel Dan, Dan, and Shia Yashuv. This was repulsed by the IDF as well. Israeli air domination, lack of communication by Syrian units, and tanks being too wide for bridges were among the causes of the unsuccessful attack of the Syrians. This caused them to abandon any attempts to make ground offensives on Israel, and airstrikes were chosen as their method instead. However, on the evening of June 5th, Israel struck Syrian airfields as part of Operation Focus, destroying 2/3 of the Syrian Air Force and forcing the rest out of the conflict. The Israeli leadership was unsure whether to attack Syria or not. On one hand, Syria was using the Golan Heights to shell Israel. On the other hand, it would have been a literally uphill battle against a fortified enemy. But intelligence about weakened positions of Syria in general, and in Golan Heights in particular, led Dayan to order an offensive on Golan without government authorization. The Israeli offensive started with airstrikes, which severely damaged the defensive infrastructure and morale of the Syrian army. The 8th Armoured Brigade, led by Colonel Albert Mandler, advanced into the Golan Heights from Givat Haim. Heavy fighting in unfavourable terrain led to numerous casualties on both sides, but with the help of their aircraft, the IDF ultimately captured the Zora, Kala, and Ein Fit fortresses. In the central sector, the Israeli 181st Battalion captured the strongholds of Dardara and Tel Hilal after fierce fighting. By the evening of June 9th, Israel reached the plateau, which allowed reinforcements to join them. By dawn, Israel had 8 brigades ready for an assault on the second line of defences. Soon, a ceasefire was negotiated around the so-called Purple Line. By the 11th of June, all military actions stopped. Up to 983 Israelis, 15,000 Egyptians, 700 Jordanians, and 2,500 Syrians were killed in action. Israel gained a huge victory. It seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the west bank of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. About 1 million Arabs were placed under Israel's direct control in the newly captured territories. The Israeli victory came as a result of more efficient military leadership, better preparation of troops, and intelligence. But the Six-Day War was by no means the last conflict, and merely 6 years later, the confrontation escalated into another war.